Welcome back to Animal Crossing New Horizons. I'm Day Darling. I should see what's going on our lovely island of Fawnhallow today, as we are recording some Animal Crossing here in the morning. I'm not busy this afternoon or evening or anything. I just was sitting around being like, what am I going to do? Let's do some Animal Crossing. Let's play some Neopets. Let's do my daily grind, I suppose. At the same time, in Neopets, it's an exciting period, I think, for those of you partaking in the Void Within event, and I've been keeping up every single day because I believe today's the first day which you can get some of those really powerful weapons, which is cool. I've been slacking, so I don't think I can get them yet, but I will get one at some point. Because that will make my Battledome pet amazingly good. Anyway, good morning everyone. Right now in Fawnhallow, it's 11:27 AM on Saturday, July 20th, 2024. I'm not exactly sure what we're going to talk about today. You know what I can talk about? This is actually something I was thinking about sort of last night and this morning. It's sort of like tangentially related to Beastars, the manga series, if you don't know, made by Paru Itagaki, something like that. And I like it. It's a good manga. Is it the best manga world? No, it's not. It's certainly flawed. It's a sort of a thing where I'd say it's more like it's really interesting because I feel like the flaws are most like well defined through its arcs. Like it starts out like pretty good. It starts out with a pretty good start, interesting world. Interesting character. Sorry, I'm speaking at 10 million miles per hour. Slow my roll. It starts out with an interesting world, interesting characters, and then it sets it up pretty interestingly, and then talks about it establishes its themes and its core concept pretty well. And then you have that entire first act, which is pretty interesting. When you have a second act, which gets pretty interesting as well. Then I can't really remember how many acts there are. It's been ages, probably 6 years or something since I read it. But the first beginning acts are pretty good, and then it sort of stagnates a bit, and then it starts getting really weird or something, and then its final act is, I was gonna say it takes a nosedive. It's not really a nosedive. It's more if it was an 8 or 9ish out of 10. I think in its peak it goes down to a 5 or 6ish, which is not bad by any means. It's definitively average. My 5 and 6 I actually treat as average rather than a fake average. But I was thinking about it because it got randomly brought up because one of my friends finished reading Beastars recently, and I was like, oh yeah, cool. And we had a small discussion about it. Nothing crazy because we didn't want to have major spoilers or anything. But now we're in an Animal Crossing episode, I can discuss to my heart's content, I suppose. But it made me reflect on it because I haven't thought about Beastars for years or something. It was definitely my favorite manga for a while, and then once it started getting to the parts of it where I was just this is a bit strange, if anything, I was like, okay, it's not really my favorite anymore, but I still enjoyed it for what it was to begin with. It just kind of had I guess the way I describe it is it had a thematic change from being a high school drama sort of thing to being very weird shonen elements. I think I spoke about it before. Beastars had very interesting world building, and then at some point the world building feels like it's introducing elements randomly out of nowhere. Anyway, that's not what I was going to talk about today. I wasn't going to do a full analysis on Beastars. I haven't read it recently. I'm not prepared to have a literary deep dive into the themes and anything which surrounds it. What I was going to talk about is because I told him that there was a side series called Beast Complex, which I thought was pretty good. It's basically, it's kind of it actually, in retrospect, I think it's actually a lot better. It's not as good as the peak of Beastars, I think. Or maybe on par with, but it's actually pretty good, and I think actually lends better to the mangaka's style, where it's basically a load of short stories set in the world of Beastars, but following different characters, these one-off stories. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, I liked a lot of these stories quite a lot because they're they sort of allow her to pick up a theme, explore it for just one chapter or so, and then leave it and drop it again. It doesn't last long enough to sort of belabor the point where you start going, this is actually a little bit weird, or I'm starting to get mixed understanding of what theme you're trying to explore here, or you're starting to lose me with it. So, and I think it does pretty well. It makes sense in these sort of small story points here and there for random lore drops to happen, being oh, this is a traditional thing which is seen in this animal society. In my opinion, that ends up working pretty well. Um, but yeah, the thing I was going to say about it was I was thinking about it more and more, and I was thinking about some of the stories, and I was like, some of them work really well, and some of them don't. But you know, there's a lot of like interesting. Well, okay, how am I going to say this? There's a lot of interesting like plot lines throughout Beast Complex, which explore thematic like elements in an interesting way. Like one I can think of off the top of my head is the one with like the fox and the chameleon, where it's all about sort of like playing into your nature, or like subverting the nature which people expect from you. It's a thing which only really works in like a Beastar sort of universe, because all the characters have like this associated preconceived notion of who they are by the fact of that animal species, you know. It's a unique world which gives you a unique space to explore specific story elements which you couldn't in a regular world, you know, the same way that you might have a fantasy world and you can explore like the differences between these fantasy races. Except for, I suppose, with animals, it ends up having a bit more of a separation, I think, from the real world sort of parallels necessary to it, which makes which sort of like muddies not muddies the point. That's not what I mean to say, but it's more like it sort of can misconstrue the point of the exploration point. Is that good or bad? I don't know. That's kind of up to you. And the world is not, and stories are not made in a vacuum. So whether that is good or is bad, I would say, yeah, it's basically up to you to decide for that. But anyway, the long and short of it is like there's a lot of interesting stories which can be explored from a way, and sometimes it does actually work pretty well. And the one I was thinking about was you know, the fox and chameleon one's a pretty good one about, you know, who you are as a person and subverting, you know, expectations. But some of them I feel like a little bit weirder as well. Like I found out there was more recent Beast Complex ones which I didn't know existed. There's a recent one about it was a zebra and the white tiger, which I thought started off very strong. I mean, it had like an incredibly like weird ending, which felt like it sort of upended the thematics. Not upended, but like it just brought up a thematic which was explored and dropped in the first like couple of panels, instead of a one which was actually carried throughout the story. But hey ho, that's neither here nor there. But it made me think even more about Beastars and Beast Complex as a whole, because it was just like, why does something about it, like it's stories as a concept work for me, but something about the execution holds it back to me. And I don't know if this is actually true or not, because I haven't had the time to really digest this through, think this through, actually like reference a source material and like analyze it to see if it makes sense. But I have this sort of idea in my mind of like, I don't know how to describe it except for like thematic overload, or perhaps better put, the overloading of a thematic. Because if you don't know, Beastars is a core part of Beastars. You might say it might be like this is shonen battle element. You might say it might be like a sort of like weird horror element of like animals eating each other. But really, the core sort of tenet behind Beastars is, weirdly, it's not a thematic in my mind. It's actually the sort of herbivore versus carnivore divide, which you might say, oh dear darling, where is your literary analysis skills at? Herbivore versus carnivore, you know, it's very used in these like very commonly used in these animal worlds, cough cough Zootopia. Of course, this is just something which is talking about like discriminatory groups, or, you know, others, so to say, like different lifestyles and viewpoints, and like that's basically the thing thematics it's exploring. That's what you mean is the core of Beastars. And I'm like, sort of like I feel like taking Beastars like as a whole, if I had to pick like one story, not story thematic, but like overarching idea of thematic it's trying to explore, is this sort of idea of like otherness, two sides of like contradictory groups which need to find a way of compromising to get along, sort of like that. But the reason I say sort of is where I go with this sort of like overloaded thematic, because in stories it's very common to have like this idea you're trying to explore, in this case, you know, the concept of being different, the concept of like discrimination or something like that. But then you explore it using a much more physical in story like way. And in this case, you might say like these fantasy races, these animal species, etc., etc. I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head, but like I can't even think of a movie right now. What's a movie which has a lot of like thematic exploration? I was just trying to think, like, what's the movie I watched recently? Like Inside Out 2, and the use of orange as anxiety, I suppose. But I'm trying to think of like this overarching idea of, I don't know, like now I'm put on the spot of like I need to think of like a thematic idea, and I'm like I can't think of one off the top of my head. Maybe what if we talk about the movie Us, because that's one which actually directly talks about the otherness, and you know it's a story which you can argue, I suppose, what it's about, but at least from my own reading, is about a divide in society. Namely, it seems to be a class divide, and the way they use red to represent, I suppose, is others, and the literal use of verticality to represent the social divide. So, you know, the story exploration idea it's exploring is a social divide, and it explores it physically with literal verticality in it, right? You see a lot of like going up and going down, representing the sort of like shifting of and viewing of different societal classes, etc., etc. So that's what I mean, and I feel like Beastars does this as well, you know. But I feel like it overloads this herbivore versus herbivore and carnivore story element. It's overloaded with so many thematic exploration things. Because one, as we said before, we established the main one which is explored is this like sense of otherness. Like, I'm not going to say necessarily discrimination as it's like of a core concept, but there's a sense of like two different groups with like almost different and unreconcilable differences. But it also sort of explores class structure in it with a way that the society is built from this herbivore in a dominant position versus carnivore. But it also explores like this sort of like predatory nature, I suppose, of it as well, like in a very physical sense, because the animals are straight up like literally eating each other, and it talks about like this innate desire behind it. But I guess that's another thing it's also exploring, is exploring this idea of like innate desire, like being born a certain way or something, like having this innate thing within inside of you, like nature versus nurture. And it also explores like relationships through this sort of way as well, like you see it like especially in a lot of the beast complex things, that like with herbivores, carnivore, this like predation, predation as in literal like eating predation, not other forms, is explored as like a substitute for a relationship, both like in a friendship or like a romantic way, but also in like a sexual way as well. And it's just like, okay, now that's what I mean. And it's like, it feels like this thematic of herbivore versus carnivore is super overloaded, like as it carries every other like idea thematic with it in the same sense, you know, which it does both favors and deficits to it, which is why I think it works better in Beast Complex than it does as Beastars, because I think overloading this thematic throughout the entirety of a not long-winded, but like a stretched out serial story like Beastars is as a main thing, it ends up like being a linchpin for so many different things that it ends up not just feeling tired, but it ends up feeling like every single thing is overloaded, or like the ideas start to get misconstrued, where it's just like, oh, it's an exploration of like these two different classes and societies, and like the power imbalance between them, of one having to hide their true nature at the same time, which makes that like things like, oh, just like, I don't know, spoilers I guess, like, oh, she eating Louis' foot, being like, okay, what is this meant to represent then? Like, is this meant to represent like a emerging society? Is this meant to represent like a relationship or something? Is this meant to represent something else? Like it gets so overloaded that anytime that story element is brought up, it now carries the burden of all these thematic ideas in it at once. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense even to me, because as I said, I was thinking about this as I was going to sleep last night, and I was thinking a little bit about it this morning as well, and I was like, this is such an interesting concept, because it's not something which I've ever seen as like a fault in any media property I've consumed. This idea that like, oh, this story element has too many thematic ideas tied to it. The more I thought about it, I was like, I don't know if it's actually true. One, I don't know if it's actually true or not. Maybe my reading comprehension is just through the floor right now, and it's absolutely terrible, and I've missed the point entirely. Completely fair. Completely fair. I'm not going to say that doesn't happen. But it was just interesting to think about, because I was just like, what an interesting thing Because, you know, I think it's easy for me to say, oh, Beastars, it has like pacing issues, it brings elements out of nowhere, and I'm like, yeah, it does, certainly, but I don't think that's a core concept of what bothered me personally about Beastars, or why it ended up falling through. That didn't happen in Beast Complex as much, because as I say, with Beast Complexes, these shorter stories, it lasts only for 20 chapters or so. You can take that herbivore versus carnivore story thematic and only attach one idea thematic to it, you know. Like, I'm trying to think of the stories now. The Fox's Chameleon doesn't really explore the herbivore versus carnivore one. It's more to do with the species, I suppose, in of itself. But let me think. Let me think. And I need to think of the stories now, which makes it incredibly hard. Like, I mean, there's a one which takes it to the classic example of, like, the two kids, the tiger and the... I don't remember what the other one even was. Like, a bear? Otter? Badger or something, where it's like two kids being friends despite the differences in one being herbivore, one being carnivore, and them understanding that someday they're going to sort of part ways. And it's sort of like this, like you know, like Romeo Juliet situation. It's not like in a love sense, but more like in like two houses divided or something. They're both from two different like families or schools of life, which should never, theoretically, doesn't interact or can't overlap in the waking world of the adult Beastars world, the cruel adult Beastars world. But because of them being like the innocence of kids, that sort of societal barrier doesn't exist. And that story, if it carried on like for, I mean, technically it is still part of the actual Beastars thing, but if it carried on for like multiple volumes and chapters, and the introduction of like this herbivore versus carnivore predatory dynamic in it as well, where, you know, the carnivores are literally eating the herbivores, and then this weird sort of societal power imbalance would like overload this thematic exploration, wouldn't it? Where it's meant to be, at least to me, like this is a story exploration of how the cruelness, I suppose, of societal barriers and the innocence of children transcending them in a certain way. It's like a tragedy, I suppose, in a sense, and that rings through, I think, because it's like short and self-contained. I'm trying to think of another one. It's really hard to think of them just like off the top of my head, because not all of them explore this. Like, maybe which is why I like this Beastars complex stuff even more. It's like it doesn't all focus on this herbivore versus carnivore thing, which comes up a lot. But like okay, like remember the tiger and the sheep one with the masseuse? Like, that's one where this herbivore versus carnivore dynamic is explored. Again, they're all like, I suppose, have a basis of different otherness to them, but like the direction they take it in differs from each of them. And this one is much more like explicit, shall we say, even if it's not technically explicit. Like, it's very overloaded with like explicit like feeling and imagery, right? Yeah, I suppose like adult content warning, I suppose. I probably should have said it at the beginning, but whatever. Like, that's a direction it ends up going in, and because it's self-contained in the story, and this sort of like reversal of dynamics in this relationship, this very intimate relationship, or becoming an intimate, or not actually an intimate relationship, makes it engaging in that sense, right? It doesn't have anything to do with like the innocence of children and the society, the cruelness of society, like not allowing these people to meet, because they are meeting, I suppose, and they're having this sort of dynamic in their own terms, quote. And because it's a self-contained story, it doesn't get muddied down with the other idea thematics overloading it as well. I don't know if this is a thing. Again, I think I might just be spouting absolute nonsense, and I might reflect on this like a few days later, being like, oh yeah, everything I said about that Beastars complex things, complete rubbish, total nonsense. But I couldn't help thinking about it, because even if it's not true in this case, what an interesting idea. The idea that you could have a thematic overload of a topic of an exploration, you know? Let's see. Thematic overload. Is that like a TV tropes thing? Phlebotinum overload. What? No. Sensory overload, demand a thematic series. Overloaded thematic? It doesn't seem like it's an actual thing, so I guess this is going to be a rather unique Animal Crossing video title. I could not just stop thinking about like the concept of this, though, of a thematic overload, and the consequences of it. Because speaking out loud, you know, I use these Animal Crossing videos as a sort of like my own soapbox to think through my own thoughts, I suppose. That makes sense to me. That makes sense of like what it is, the consequences of it, and what it made me feel about it, and why I think it's not all it, and why it ended up detracting, I suppose, from something rather than necessarily adding to it. At least it feels logically consistent enough in my head that I'm just like, okay, I'm willing to believe it, at least for now. What an interesting idea, though. Anyway, I'm going to round this episode off here, and I'm going to record some other YouTube videos. Oh, maybe not immediately. So, if you have been watching, thank you very much. It's been Animal Crossing New Horizons. I've been Dear Darling. Likes, comments, subscription, shares, greatly appreciated. Socials, Discord down below. Hope to see each other again. But for now, it's our farewell. So until next time, bye-bye for now.